I never imagined that a simple envelope could carry the weight of betrayal. I was sorting through some old mail in the study when I saw it. A stack of documents, official looking, stamped and signed, tucked behind a pile of letters I had assumed were harmless. At first, I didn't understand. My uncle's name kept appearing on every page, each line whispering something I didn't want to hear. The property deeds, the account statements, the signatures in ink that felt heavier than any stone I'd ever lifted. They weren't just papers. They were a roadmap of decisions made without me about something that was mine by right. I picked up the first document, hand shaking, heart hammering like a drum in a hall of echoes. My inheritance, years of promises, memories tied to family land, and my late parents' careful planning had been sold, and I hadn't even known it. My uncle, the person I had trusted more than anyone outside my immediate family, had signed the papers, pocketed the money, and never told me a word. For a second, I stared at the documents like they might transform before my eyes. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe there was an explanation that would make all of this just a misunderstanding. But the numbers, the contracts, the dates, they didn't lie. The $200,000 that should have been mine, that should have been untouchable, had disappeared into someone else's hands, and my uncle's name was printed clearly at the top, an accusation in itself. Anger bubbled up first, not the kind that flares and disappears, but a slow, simmering kind that burrows under your ribs and makes your chest ache, and alongside it, disbelief. How could someone I trusted so completely, someone who had smiled at me, shared jokes, given advice, and even seemed proud at the small moments, betray me so thoroughly? How could the person I thought of as family turn into the exact opposite in the blink of an eye? I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to shake him until the truth spilled out. But the reality hit me like a cold wind. This wasn't a simple argument I could resolve with words. This was something bigger, something calculated. And I realized, sitting there on the edge of the study chair, the first flicker of determination igniting inside me. I wouldn't just let this go. I would find a way to make things right. And I would do it on my own terms, because betrayal like this deserves more than anger. It deserves justice. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by stacks of ink-stained paper, I understood something chilling. The people you trust most can hurt you the deepest, but it's in that hurt that you find your strength. I sank into the armchair, the document still clutched in my hands, staring blankly at the wall. It wasn't just about the money, though $200,000 disappearing felt like a punch straight to the gut. It was about everything that money represented. The inheritance wasn't just dollars on a page. It was the last connection to my parents' legacy, the security I had counted on for years, the promise that even if the world turned cold, part of my family had my back. And now, that promise had been broken, ripped away in silence while I slept, laughed, and trusted. A cold knot tightened in my chest. If my uncle got away with this, if no one stopped him, I wasn't just losing money. I was losing my sense of safety, the foundation I had built my life on. Every plan I had made, every dream I had quietly nurtured, suddenly felt fragile, like a glass figurine teetering on the edge of a shelf. I could see it all falling apart. The rent, the bills, the college tuition I had saved for, even the small things I'd promised myself along the way. All gone because someone I trusted had decided my future didn't matter. But worse than that was the betrayal. The sting of realizing the person I had called family, the one I had trusted with my life, had violated that trust. It wasn't just a transaction. It was a statement. The message was clear. My needs, my rights, my place in this family didn't matter. Watching him smile at family gatherings, pretending nothing had happened, was going to be unbearable if I didn't do something. Every holiday, every birthday, every casual conversation would carry the weight of that betrayal, and I couldn't stand the thought of living under that shadow for the rest of my life. I thought about the ripple effect it would have. Friends and distant relatives who had assumed everything was fine. They would see me as foolish or naive. My reputation, my sense of self, the dignity I had carried quietly, all threatened to crumble. And the deeper truth hit harder. It wasn't just the inheritance he had stolen, it was trust itself. The invisible thread that ties families together. If that snapped, if it went unanswered, nothing in my life would feel safe again. So I made a silent promise to myself, one that trembled with fear but burned with determination. I wouldn't just let this slide, I would fight. Not out of anger alone, but to reclaim what was mine, to prove that betrayal didn't get to write the ending of my story. And in that promise, the stakes became painfully clear. this wasn't just about money. It was about justice, pride, and the knowledge that some wrongs demand correction, no matter how close to home they strike. I grew up thinking family was the one constant in life, the thread that tied everything together. My uncle had always been a fixture in our household, the older figure who could make me laugh, who taught me how to ride a bike, and who would listen when no one else seemed to understand. I looked up to him, trusted him with secrets I never told my parents, and believed that he had my back no matter what. But trust is a fragile thing, and innocence often blinds you to the cracks forming beneath the surface. As a child, I remember sitting on the porch while he told me stories about his own parents, the lessons they had taught him, the values he said he lived by. He was my guide, my mentor in ways that weren't always obvious, and I carried his words with me through the small victories and the minor heartbreaks of my early years. We had shared moments that felt like the kind of memories you tuck into a box and never forget. The summer afternoons, fishing by the lake, our hands sticky with ice cream, arguing playfully over which of us could run faster or climb higher. He'd always let me win, or at least make me think I had, and those little victories meant more than he could ever know. I never imagined that the person who had given me so much laughter could also be capable of the kind of betrayal that now lay in front of me, inked in contracts and sealed with signatures. My parents, too, were careful planners. They had always spoken about inheritance as though it were a safety net, something I could count on when life became unpredictable. It wasn't just the financial security, it was the trust, the quiet reassurance that the family would honor promises made across generations. I had watched my uncle handle matters of money and property for years, assuming his guidance was a blessing, never questioning his motives. We laughed about joint family gatherings, holiday dinners, and birthdays, and I believed that beneath the normal chaos of our family, fairness and integrity existed. Even in moments of tension, there was a sense of unspoken loyalty. I remember one winter evening when the furnace broke and my uncle stayed up all night helping my dad repair it. I shivered on the couch, blanket pulled tight, and watched them work, feeling safe, knowing that family meant showing up when it mattered most. But as I grew older, I started noticing subtle signs that trust was not evenly distributed. Certain decisions seemed to favor him or others in the family, and yet I brushed it off. As inconsequential, I wanted to believe in his goodness, in the bond we had. School years came and went, and I often confided in him more than anyone else. He'd offer advice on projects, encourage me when grades faltered, and praise achievements with an authenticity that made me feel seen. I felt a quiet pride in having him in my corner. And yet, somewhere in the background of those childhood memories, there were hints I didn't understand at the time. Furtive phone calls, unexplained smiles, the way certain topics were avoided around me, the way money seemed to flow freely to others while I was told to wait my turn or be patient. I realize now that these were the threads of a pattern, subtle but persistent. The same hands that guided me, that lifted me when I fell, were also capable of removing what was mine when I wasn't looking. That tension, invisible to me as a child, has a clarity now I couldn't have imagined then. And as I look back on those years, I see that the foundation I had built my trust on was only half solid. Every fond memory, every laugh, every lesson carried weight, but some carried a hidden cost, one I would only fully understand when the betrayal became undeniable. Even now, the nostalgia lingers. I can hear his voice telling me to work hard, to be patient, to trust in family. I can see his eyes, warm and inviting, in the photographs of holidays and birthdays. And yet, juxtaposed with those images, I see the stark reality. The same person who molded my childhood, who shaped my understanding of trust, had chosen to act against me in the most consequential way. That duality, the warmth and the betrayal, the laughter and the contracts that stole my inheritance, is what drives me forward now. Because understanding family history isn't just about remembering the good, it's about seeing the threads of truth that run through the chaos, the moments that mattered, and the choices that ultimately define who can be trusted and who cannot. It started with a letter that arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that feels like it has no significance until it does. I almost tossed it aside, assuming it was another promotional offer or a routine notice, but the official seal, crisp and undeniable, made me pause. My hand shook as I broke the envelope open, and the pages inside revealed a truth I wasn't prepared for. My inheritance, my parents' carefully preserved estate, the security I had assumed was untouchable, had been sold. And the signature at the bottom? My uncle's. I reread the papers 3 times, hoping that some detail would magically change, that maybe I had misunderstood the legal jargon. But each time, the reality pressed harder, like a hand wrapping around my chest. $200,000 gone. My future manipulated, diverted, hijacked by someone I had trusted more than anyone else outside my parents. The magnitude of it left me breathless, the betrayal heavier than any sum of money could account for. I called him immediately, trying to steady my voice, trying to force a calm I didn't feel. "Uncle, what is this?" I asked, holding the papers like evidence in a courtroom I hadn't yet entered. There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. "Camilla," he began, slow and measured, "it was just a business decision you'll understand someday. It was for the best." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that for the best didn't erase the trust he had shattered, didn't undo years of reliance and hope, but the words stuck in my throat, swallowed by a mixture of disbelief and an icy, rising determination. I hung up, staring at the phone as if it could suddenly offer answers it never would. The days that followed were a blur of research calls and quiet frustration. I pored over property records, account statements, and legal clauses I barely understood, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. Each new discovery deepened the pit in my stomach. He hadn't just acted hastily. This was deliberate, calculated, a betrayal that required forethought and premeditation. Every page I found, every signature I traced, confirmed what I already knew in my gut. My uncle had taken what was mine and assumed I would do nothing, but I couldn't let that happen. I remembered the lessons from childhood, the stubborn streak that had pushed me through exams, late-night jobs, and personal struggles. I would fight this, not just for the money, but for the principle, for the dignity that had been stripped from me, and slowly a plan formed. I documented everything. I took photos of every document, filed them meticulously, created a timeline of actions, and began compiling the evidence I would need to take this to court. Every step was accompanied by emotional turbulence. Anger, yes, but also grief, disbelief, and the hollow ache of being betrayed by someone who should have been family. I replayed our memories, trying to reconcile the uncle who had once held me when I fell with the man who had now sold my future without a word. How could the same person be both caretaker and thief? It was a question that gnawed at the edges of my mind, keeping sleep elusive, thoughts racing into the night. At times, I doubted myself. What if I didn't have enough proof? What if no one believed me and the court sided with him simply because he had influence, because he was family? I felt small in those moments, powerless, weighed down by the enormity of the fight ahead, but each doubt was met with a flicker of resolve. I remembered the quiet pride of self-reliance that had carried me through college, the countless nights spent laboring in silence, building my own future without asking for handouts. If I had survived those struggles, I could survive this. I started reaching out to professionals, lawyers, financial advisors, anyone who could help me untangle the web he had spun. Each conversation was a mixture of hope and intimidation. The legal world was intimidating, filled with jargon and strategy I had never faced before. Yet, with every email sent, every consultation attended, my confidence grew. The more I learned, the more I realized that knowledge was my weapon and preparation my shield. Even amid all this planning, the emotional weight remained. I'd catch myself replaying the moment of discovery over and over. The letter in my hands, the shock freezing me in place, the quiet realization that someone I had trusted had acted against me. But gradually, that shock transformed into fuel. It sharpened my focus, sharpened my resolve. I could not undo the betrayal, but I could make sure it didn't go unchallenged. Late nights were spent in a quiet corner of my apartment, surrounded by papers, legal pads, and coffee cups that grew cold too quickly. I made lists, drafted letters, outlined arguments, and rehearsed conversations I might have in court. It was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, but there was purpose in it, a rhythm that transformed helplessness into action. Every detail mattered. Every small victory in understanding the legal maze became a step toward reclaiming what was rightfully mine. By the end of those weeks, I felt a cautious, quiet sense of readiness. I was still angry. I was still hurt. But For the first time since discovering the betrayal, I also felt powerful. I had prepared, documented, and strategized. I had taken the first steps toward holding my uncle accountable. And in that readiness, there was clarity. I would not allow this act to define me. I would take back what was mine, piece by piece, and in doing so, I would reclaim not just the inheritance, but my trust, my dignity, and my voice. The road ahead would be long, uncertain, and filled with challenges. But as I stared at the stack of documents on my desk, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had underestimated me. And that, more than anything else, was the first step toward victory. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and paper, a faint trace of coffee lingering in the air. I sat in the gallery, hands folded in my lap, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt louder than the murmurs of the crowd. Across from me, my uncle sat in the defendant's chair, his expression calm, too calm, like he had rehearsed this 1,000 times. But I knew the truth, and that truth had weight heavier than any practiced smile. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The gavel echoed like a gunshot, and suddenly everything felt more immediate, more real. I caught my uncle's eyes briefly. There was a flicker, a shadow of doubt, a crack in the mask he wore so easily. He glanced toward our family, who had come to watch, unsure where their loyalties should lie. I didn't need them to support me. I had prepared for this moment meticulously, every detail documented, every argument rehearsed. My lawyer began presenting the case, and I felt a steady calm settle over me as each fact was laid bare. The contracts, the signatures, the transfers all pointed to a single, undeniable conclusion. The inheritance had been sold without my knowledge or consent. Each document was like a brick in a wall I was building around my claim, and with each brick, the foundation of my uncle's defense seemed shakier. I watched him squirm when the timeline was presented, when the financial statements proved that he had acted deliberately, not an error or misunderstanding. His confident composure faltered as my attorney calmly explained the consequences, the violation of trust, and the legal obligation to return the funds. The silence that followed each revelation was palpable, a heavy pause where everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next blow. And then came my turn. I stood slowly, hands still, voice steady, though my chest burned with every word. I recounted our family history, not to vilify him, not to attack, but to frame the betrayal, to show the human cost behind the numbers. I spoke of nights spent worrying about tuition, of the quiet moments of humiliation when I discovered the truth, of the hope I had clung to, and the perseverance that had carried me through sleepless nights and endless research. I saw the reactions in the courtroom. The judge listened intently, pen poised above a notepad. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances they couldn't disguise. Even my uncle, normally so self-assured, seemed to shrink under the weight of my words. The reality that the person he had underestimated was standing before everyone, commanding attention, demanding justice. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead or beg. I presented the facts, the emotional truth, and the evidence that supported it. And in that restraint, there was power. Every lawyer, every clerk, every person in the gallery felt the gravity of what had been done. The room was no longer just a courtroom. It was a stage for accountability, and I was at the center. When the judge finally spoke, the words cut through the tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Based on the evidence presented, the court orders that the defendant return the full sum of $200,000 to the plaintiff. The room seemed to exhale collectively, a ripple of murmurs and nods washing over the gallery. My uncle's face went pale, the mask of confidence shattered. My parents looked stunned, as if the verdict had illuminated a truth they had been avoiding. I remained seated for a moment, letting the words sink in. $200,000 restored was not the point. The point was the acknowledgement that I had been wronged, that my perseverance and dignity had been recognized, and that the silence I had endured was no longer invisible. I felt a quiet, profound sense of relief, a stillness that wrapped around me like a protective cloak. As I stood to leave, I met my uncle's gaze. There was no need for words. The look in his eyes said what mine already knew. He had underestimated me. He had assumed my silence meant acceptance, that my trust could be exploited without consequence. Now he knew differently. I walked past him, head held high, every step a reclaiming of the space he had tried to take from me. Outside the courtroom, the sunlight was sharp and liberating. I breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, the warmth on my skin, a reminder that freedom isn't always about distance. It's about the justice you carve out for yourself. My parents stayed behind, unsure of how to approach me, and I didn't rush to fill that gap. I had learned that recognition and validation must be earned, not demanded. Later, when the funds were finally returned, I didn't celebrate with fanfare. Instead, I sat quietly in my apartment, the statement in hand, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The inheritance was restored, yes, but what mattered more was the reclamation of trust, of dignity, and the knowledge that no one, no matter how close to you, could define your worth without consequence. I realized then that justice wasn't just about money. It was about walking into a room where your rights had been ignored and leaving with your integrity intact. It was about proving to yourself that perseverance, research, and courage could overcome betrayal. And it was about finally understanding that some victories are measured not in applause, but in quiet affirmation, in the reclaiming of what had always belonged to you. That night, as I locked my door and reflected on the events, I smiled softly. The road had been long, filled with doubt, anger, and sleepless nights, but I had arrived. $200,000 returned was more than a financial victory. It was proof that standing up for yourself, even against family, could reclaim not just wealth, but self-respect, independence, and peace. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly unburdened, walking forward into life on my own terms with nothing and no one left to hold me back. Sitting back in my apartment, the quiet finally settling around me, I let myself breathe. The fight had been long, grueling, and at times emotionally exhausting, but in the end, it had been worth every sleepless night and every anxious moment. I thought about the inheritance, yes, but more than that, I thought about the lesson it had taught me. Standing up for yourself is never selfish. It's necessary. Family, trust, and loyalty are invaluable, but they are not unconditional. And when those bonds are broken, it doesn't make you weak to assert your rights. It makes you aware. It makes you strong. I had learned that silence can be dangerous when it's expected to protect someone else's comfort, but action, even if uncomfortable, can reclaim your dignity in ways you never imagined. I want anyone listening who has faced betrayal, who has felt overlooked or undervalued, to understand this. Your worth isn't defined by the people who ignore you. It's defined by the courage you summon, by the perseverance you choose when the odds are against you. The $200,000 was just a number, but the confidence, independence, and self-respect I gained, those are immeasurable. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever had to reclaim what was taken from you or fight for recognition in the face of family betrayal, share your story. Below, sometimes our voices are the most powerful proof of resilience, and if you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories that remind us all of the strength we carry quietly within ourselves. Reclaiming what is rightfully yours is not just about justice. It's about walking into life knowing that your voice, your effort, and your persistence matter. It's about understanding that even in the face of betrayal, you have the power to rewrite the story. And sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that change you the most. Remember, standing up for yourself doesn't make you ungrateful or angry. It makes you empowered. And in that empowerment, you find freedom, respect, and the ability to keep moving forward on your own terms, unshaken, unstoppable.